I remember the sound before I remember the sight. It rolled through the grand galactic senate like a living organism, layered, overlapping, sharp-edged. It struck the vaulted ceilings and came back louder, as if the chamber itself approved. I had attended thousands of proceedings in that hall, witnessed declarations of war, extinction votes, first contact ceremonies. Never had I heard laughter like that. Not amusement, not joy. Contempt. At the center of it all stood the human emperor. He was smaller than I expected. Not physically unimposing, humans rarely were, but symbolically naked. No exosuit gleamed at his shoulders, no honor guard flanked him with plasma halberds or ceremonial banners. He wore simple fabric robes, dark and unadorned, as if he had come to mourn rather than negotiate. His hands were bare, his posture straight, though exhaustion bent him in ways no gravity ever could. We, the elder species, watched from our elevated tiers of stone and alloy, arranged by age, power, and conquest. I sat among the archivists, my duty to observe, record, and remember. At the time, I believed humanity would not give us anything worth remembering. They had been summoned to hear their judgment. For cycles uncounted, humanity had resisted integration into the Galactic Compact. They had questioned trade edicts, ignored cultural compliance mandates, and, most unforgivable of all, survived economic blockades designed to break lesser civilizations. Species older and wiser than mine had collapsed under such pressure. Humanity endured. That endurance had been labeled defiance. Accusations descended on the emperor like meteor fire. Primitive, the economists declared. Reckless, cried the military delegates. Dangerous, whispered the cultural councils, as if the word itself might bite. I believed them. I admit this now because truth demands it. From the data alone, humanity seemed an anomaly. Too aggressive for peace, too stubborn for control. The Senate preferred predictability. Humans were not predictable. Through it all, the emperor remained silent. He did not argue as the charges were read. He did not raise his voice when his people were reduced to statistics and risk assessments. His gaze moved slowly across the chamber, lingering on faces that would not meet his eyes. There was no fear in him, only a quiet attention that made me unexpectedly uneasy. When he finally spoke, it was not loud. There was no amplification, yet his words carried.
The question struck the chamber like a misfired pulse, soft but destabilizing. Conversations faltered. Some delegates scoffed. Others shifted in their seats. I searched my own memory, my internal archives racing through millennia of recorded history. No one answered. The silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable, before the presiding High Archon dismissed it with a dismissive flick of his many-jointed hand. His ceremonial cloak shimmered with authority protocols woven into living silk. Humanity is not here to question history, the Archon intoned. The verdict followed swiftly. Protections revoked, diplomatic immunities suspended, human space reclassified as provisional territory, an elegant term meaning available. The laughter returned, quieter now, satisfied. I felt a flicker of something then. Not sympathy, not yet. Something closer to anticipation. The Archon gestured to the guards. The guards advanced, armored titans bred and trained to enforce Senate will. They moved with ritual precision, certain of their role in an ancient pattern. I had seen this before. Species removed, leaders silenced, history neatly concluded. But before the guards could reach him, the human emperor stepped forward. He did not resist. He did not flee. He took one measured step, then another, closing the distance between himself and the Archon's dais. I felt it then, a subtle shift in the air, like pressure building before a storm. My sensory membranes prickled. Others noticed it too. The laughter died mid-breath. The emperor raised his hand. It was an unremarkable hand. 5 fingers, scarred skin, no weapons. And yet, when it closed around the Archon's ceremonial cloak, the chamber froze. No alarms sounded, no protocols engaged. The High Archon gasped, not in pain, but in shock. No being had touched a presiding Archon in over 3,000 cycles. The rules had not accounted for this moment. Silence fell, complete and absolute. I remember thinking, with sudden clarity, that we had misunderstood something fundamental about humans. And as the Emperor tightened his grip,
and took his first step forward, dragging authority itself with him. I realized the laughter had not been the end of the trial. It had been the beginning. The moment the human touched the Archon, the chamber should have erupted. Alarms, energy barriers, containment fields, all were designed for just such an eventuality. Protocols etched into our collective memory, encoded in every defensive algorithm, should have screamed. But nothing activated, not a single safeguard. I watched, unblinking, as the Emperor pulled. Not with brute force, not with fury or desperation, but with a calm that made the impossible seem inevitable. The Archon's claws scraped the polished stone floor. His voice, usually a roar that could silence a dozen delegates at once, cracked into guttural gasps. Every senator froze. Shock, pure and unfiltered, ran like electricity through the chamber. Humans, I reminded myself, were classified as mid-strength mammals. Their biology was noted, analyzed, cataloged. Diplomatic files described aggression in measured terms: survival instinct, tenacity, adaptive resilience. Nothing mentioned the capacity to bend tradition itself into obedience. Nothing mentioned that patience, in a human, could be lethal in ways our weapons never were. Step by deliberate step, the Emperor advanced, dragging the Archon across the dais. The Senate guards, bred to respond with instantaneous precision, hesitated. Tradition, it seemed, had more authority than protocol. No one had ever touched a presiding Archon before. None had imagined the possibility. Our rules, our centuries of accumulated law, had no precedent for this. As the pair passed my tier, I could see his face clearly for the first time. The Emperor's eyes were tired, lined with shadows of long nights and longer wars, yet his expression radiated something I could not catalog: resolve. He spoke, his voice carrying across the hall without amplification, resonating in a way that bypassed barriers, protocols, and doubt. "You judge us for surviving," he said, each word deliberate, measured. It was not a threat. It was a verdict. Each step echoed across the marble floor, each scrape of the Archon's claws a punctuation. I felt something coil in my thorax, not fear of violence, but fear of truth. Humanity had never been weak. Their strength had lain in endurance, in patience, in refusing to act until the moment of consequence arrived. And now, as I watched the Emperor advance, dragging authority itself behind him, I understood. Patience was far more terrifying than rage. The Senate had expected defiance in form of war. Instead, it faced a quiet, unstoppable certainty, and the echo of that certainty filled every corner of the chamber. No one would forget this day. Not yet. And yet, the climax had only begun.
The halls of the Grand Galactic Senate were sacred, older than most of the species who now occupied them. Walls carved from obsidian and silver, etched with victories and treaties, bore the names of civilizations long erased by time. Their legacy was not simply in stone. It was in memory, in the unyielding weight of history. Yet as the human emperor dragged the Archon through those corridors, I realized the halls themselves were witnessing something new: defiance, married to purpose. We followed, physically constrained by curiosity, morally compelled by awe. Every step of the Emperor's quiet march forced us to see what we had ignored. Senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers bouncing along the polished walls. I watched from my tier as the Archon, once unshakable, now scraped across the floor, stumbling beneath a force that seemed almost metaphysical. The Emperor stopped before a relief depicting the Senate's founding war, a brutal conflict that had forged this institution, memorialized in stone and blood. I had passed it countless times, my eyes trained only on my assigned observations. Never had I truly seen it. The human Emperor made us look. "This," he said, releasing the Archon at last, his hand falling away like a quiet bell toll, "is why this Senate exists." The Archon opened his mouth, intending speech, but it failed him. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with revelation. I understood then. Humans did not need claws, plasma cannons, or fleets of warships to dominate a room. They wielded something far older and more fearsome: memory, history, and the weight of truth. Shame became a weapon sharper than any blade. He named worlds humanity had saved, speaking of evacuations unrecorded, fleets dispatched without glory,
Wars fought so that others might live in peace. None of it appeared in Senate archives. All of it had been erased, or worse, mischaracterized as aggression. Each revelation fractured something within me. Admiration, shame, fear mingled until I could scarcely breathe. The Emperor's gaze swept the chamber, holding each species accountable, not with violence, but with clarity. Every lie the Senate had perpetuated, every omission we had sanctioned, was now exposed. He did not demand acknowledgement. He commanded it. When he turned back toward the chamber, I understood the truth. This was no longer a trial. It was a reckoning. And in that instant, I knew the galaxy would never see humans the same way again.
The broadcast feeds had vanished. Every channel, every recording, every observation point had gone dark, not by accident, not by Senate decree, but by human design. At first, many of us suspected cowardice, an attempt to conceal weakness. But as the silence deepened, I realized the truth. The humans had cut the feeds not to hide, but to focus attention, to ensure that what was said reached only those who truly mattered. The Emperor returned to the Senate floor alone. The Archon did not follow. He stood there, stripped of ceremonial trappings, no guard at his side, unamplified by technology, unshielded from scrutiny. And yet, as he opened his mouth, every delegate leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but because the weight of what was coming could not be ignored. He spoke of Earth first, scorched, rebuilt, scorched again, cities leveled by war, yet rising again from ashes, of colonies abandoned in silence so refugees could flee across the stars, of soldiers who fought knowing that history would not remember them, that their names would vanish into the void. Every word carved a truth we had long refused to see. Humanity was not fragile. Humanity was forged. We learned resilience because extinction chased us from our first breath, he said, his voice quiet, carrying with impossible clarity across the chamber. I felt it then, the visceral dread that comes not from immediate danger, but from the realization that an entire species had endured the impossible and still stood. These were not being shaped by slow evolution alone. They had been tempered by fire, sharpened by loss, and hardened by relentless survival. The galaxy feared them because they were tested, not merely grown. The Emperor did not demand mercy. He did not threaten. Instead, he offered terms: partnership with accountability, an end to silent exploitation, a promise of collaboration built on recognition rather than dominance. There was no bluster, no intimidation, only clarity, the kind of clarity that leaves no room for falsehood. The vote was unanimous, not because of fear, not because of force, because at last we understood. We understood the cost of ignoring humanity, the magnitude of the lives they had saved, and the quiet, unstoppable endurance that defined them. As the chamber's gavel fell in record silence, I realized the truth. The galaxy had stopped watching, but the humans, quiet, patient, indomitable, had not. And in that moment, I understood that the true power of humanity was never their strength alone, but the patience and purpose with which they wielded it. The reckoning had only just begun. The judgment, when it came, or rather, when it did not, was quiet, almost imperceptible. Not a single gavel pounded, no grand announcement echoed through the chambers. Records were amended, striking out accusations, nullifying sanctions, and erasing classifications that had long constrained humanity. Alliances were rewritten, treaties adjusted, entire bureaucracies reshaped in the span of a single silent cycle. Yet the Emperor did not celebrate. He did not raise his arms in triumph. No banners fluttered in artificial wind. No ceremonial music played. He walked out of the Senate alone, the footsteps of one species echoing like a heartbeat in a hall filled with multitudes. Behind him lingered the silence of beings who had witnessed the unimaginable and would never forget it. I watched him go, his robe trailing faintly across the polished floors, and understood what we had failed to see for centuries. Humanity had not won by dominance, by overwhelming firepower, or by manipulation of political machinery. They had won through endurance, through patience, through refusing to vanish when the universe demanded it. Every obstacle, every siege, every insult endured
had accumulated into a force that no convention could contain. The Archon, once a figure of unshakable authority, later resigned. Tradition, the foundation upon which centuries of governance had rested, shattered under the weight of truth. Protocols and histories that had once seemed immutable crumbled silently, leaving only the record of what had actually happened. The galaxy shifted that day, not in explosions or battles, but in understanding. Systems recalibrated their perceptions. Councils reconsidered the morality of past decisions. Species previously arrogant in their assessments of humans now trembled at the realization that they had nearly destroyed something far greater than themselves. I, an observer bound by the memory of events, recorded each moment, yet even I struggled to contain the enormity. Humanity had endured where others would have broken. They had rewritten the rules without speaking a word of defiance. And as the doors of the Senate sealed behind the Emperor, I realized the quietest victories often leave the deepest scars and the most lasting respect. The reckoning was complete, but its lessons were only beginning to spread. In the cycles that followed, the galaxy observed humanity in ways it had never imagined. They became more than a species. They became a standard, a moral constant, a benchmark against which every civilization measured its own sense of purpose and responsibility. When disasters struck across star systems, human ships arrived first, not for profit, not for recognition, not for conquest, but for rescue. Their fleets carried supplies, engineers, medics, and whatever tools the victims lacked to rebuild shattered worlds. Entire colonies thought lost to plague, war, or cosmic calamity found salvation under the quiet, resolute guidance of human hands. When disputes flared between rival civilizations, when fleets bristled with weapons and tempers, human diplomats arrived, not as enforcers, not as conquerors, but as mediators. They stood between warships like living shields, their words precise and deliberate, their presence enough to give pause to generals and admirals who had long believed that negotiation was weakness. I observed one such event. 2 fleets braced for annihilation above a dying planet. Human envoys, unarmed, approached in fragile shuttles, and somehow, with nothing but logic, patience, and moral authority, they compelled both sides to stand down. What struck me most was that humanity never forgot. They did not forgive easily, nor did they ignore the wrongs committed against them. Yet they chose to build anyway, to repair, to nurture, to protect. They had suffered famine, annihilation, betrayal, and endless cycles of suffering. Yet the response of humanity was never vengeance alone. It was creation. Each act of endurance became a lesson, each rescue a reminder that history mattered, that memory shaped morality. I began studying their philosophy, their literature, their unrecorded oral traditions. It was simplicity itself, but it carried weight deeper than any treaty, harder than any starshow hull, and more enduring than the obsidian walls of the Senate. We endure. Not merely survive, not merely persist, endure. Persist with purpose, with memory, with intention. The phrase became a mantra, repeated silently in my mind every time I witnessed humanity act, every time they confronted cruelty with patience, every time they transformed suffering into resilience. I came to understand why they had dragged an emperor through stone halls, not to humiliate him.
Not to display their strength or flaunt dominance over centuries of tradition. No. They did it to teach a lesson that transcended the immediate spectacle. That power, when divorced from memory, becomes cruelty. That authority without conscience is a weapon. That governance without respect for history and sacrifice is tyranny. By dragging the Archon through the corridors lined with centuries of blood, treaties, and unrecorded wars, humanity reminded us, quietly yet unmistakably, that endurance, ethical memory, and courage were far more formidable than armies or fleets. I watched systems shift their understanding. I recorded reports of younger civilizations reevaluating their histories, questioning their moral compass,
measuring themselves against an example they could not ignore. Entire sectors began to consult human archives, not for strategy, but for philosophy. They read of worlds saved without expectation, wars fought without recognition, catastrophes averted because humans endured where others might have given up. Even centuries later, I could not erase the impression of that quiet moral force. Humanity was no longer merely a participant in galactic politics, they were a standard, a living ethical framework. Ships that once carried only weapons now carried hope. Envoys that once delivered ultimatums now delivered understanding. And the phrase, "we endure," was repeated quietly by every observer who witnessed a human act of courage, endurance, or mercy. I realized then that endurance, when wielded with conscience, reshapes the universe. It bends not the laws of physics, but the laws of morality. It rewrites the calculus of power. Humanity had taught the stars a lesson that would echo for millennia, that memory strengthens authority, that endurance trumps aggression, and that the quiet application of moral force can achieve what fleets, weapons, and bureaucracy cannot. And as I recorded every detail, every act, every choice, I understood the terrifying, awe-inspiring truth. Humanity's legacy was not in domination. It was in their refusal to yield, their insistence on remembering, and their relentless dedication to endure, and through that endurance, to teach the galaxy what it meant to wield power with conscience. In every corner of the stars, their influence spread silently, shaping decisions, guiding young civilizations, and reminding all of us that endurance is more than survival. It is the foundation of morality itself.
The galaxy had learned, finally, that humans endure, and endurance, in their hands, was unstoppable. Now, when new species enter the Summit, the story is told, not as legend, not as myth, not as embellishment for diplomatic effect, but as warning. I tell it myself. I recount the day the galaxy laughed at humans, and the day we learned why they never laughed back. I begin with the echoes of that first laughter, rolling through the chamber like living metal, sharp and cruel. I speak of the human emperor, small and unarmed, standing alone in the center of the Grand Senate, while accusations of weakness and recklessness rained down. The young species listen with wide, unblinking eyes, their minds struggling to grasp a courage so simple yet so absolute. I describe how he touched the Archon's ceremonial cloak, dragging authority itself across the marble floor, step by deliberate step. Their tentacles twitch, their scales ruffle. Some cannot believe such restraint could contain such force. I tell them of the halls built on bones, of walls etched with victories and treaties, and of how the Emperor forced us to look at the relief of the Senate's founding war. I describe the quiet power of memory, history, and moral authority, and how humans wielded it more effectively than any fleet or weapon. I recount how entire civilizations had been saved, wars averted, colonies preserved, all without seeking glory, and how we, the elder species, had taken their endurance for granted, labeled it defiance. I explain the moment the galaxy stopped watching, how humanity cut the feeds, not to hide the truth, but to ensure it reached only those who could comprehend it. How the Emperor spoke of burned and rebuilt worlds, of soldiers forgotten by history, and of a species tempered by extinction itself, and how, when he offered partnership instead of vengeance, we realized we had misjudged them for millennia. I described the judgment that was never passed, how sanctions were erased, alliances rewritten, and how even the Archon resigned, tradition shattered under the weight of truth. I recount the cycles that followed, where humanity became a moral constant, their fleets delivering aid, their diplomats standing between warring worlds, their endurance shaping the decisions of all who observed them. They hear it whispered in corridors, carried across sectors by envoys, repeated in the records of rescue operations, in the quiet heroism of humans who never sought praise.
They begin to understand. Finally, I tell them the most important truth. Humans do not need to shout to change the universe. They do not need to roar or brandish weapons. They do not need the spectacle of armies or explosions. They only need to keep standing. And in that silence, in that simple act of endurance, the galaxy learns, slowly, painfully, irreversibly. When I finish, there is a hush. Not awe alone, Not fear alone, but something more enduring, comprehension. Because humans endure, and the universe, at last, cannot ignore them.